Okay, so good afternoon, everybody in Europe, and good morning to all of you who have joined us from North America today. My name is Lars Hartkopf. I'm the Regional Marketing Director for EMEA here at Netbiscuits, and I'd like to welcome everybody to this webinar on the topic of how to future-proof your mobile strategy. This session is jointly presented by comScore and Netbiscuits, and we'll be talking about some of the challenges associated with building a mobile channel strategy and discuss the opportunities that exist for mobile engagement. But before we start, I'd like to give you a quick overview of the agenda and introduce today's speakers. The webinar is scheduled to run for 45 minutes, and the agenda is really split into three parts. The first part will give you an update on the mobile landscape in Europe and North America. We will be focusing on three different areas here. A, the overall PC versus mobile situation. B, the multi-device reality of today. And C, the relevance of context in form of device features, network conditions, user location, or time of day. The second part will draw the conclusions to show you how you can future-proof your mobile strategies. Again, we will be focusing on three different areas. A, organizational considerations. B, the underlying technology stack. And 3, how to use contextual data as the foundation for the next level of mobile user experiences. Finally, we'll be spending some time responding to questions from the audience. Okay, so now it's time to introduce our speakers. We'll start with Gregor Smith. He's Enterprise Director with comScore. Gregor is based in the UK and has over 14 years of sales experience across print, online and mobile. Previously, he's worked for O2 Media, Orange and Adphonic before he started his current role at comScore in 2012. Gregor will then hand the session over to Anthony Payne, Director of Global Product Marketing for Netbiscuits in the UK, who joined the company this year. Prior to that, Anthony spent 3 years in enterprise developer marketing at BlackBerry and held various marketing and product management roles for companies including GXS and GE. Before we now start the session, a few words with regards to housekeeping for the audience. Participants can submit a question to our speakers at any time via the questions tool on the right of your screen. Please indicate, just by dropping the name, which of our speakers you'd like to address. If we run out of time and your question has not been answered during the session, we will follow up with you directly offline. And lastly, we'll be recording today's session to share with you as an on-demand link shortly afterwards. All right. So that was my introduction. Now I'm changing presenter and handing over to you, Gregor.
Thanks very much, Lars. Hope everyone can hear me okay. So just a little bit of background on comScore first. comScore is a global internet technology company providing customers with analytics for a digital world. We were founded in 1999. And probably best known as the gold standard for measuring digital activity. That includes website visitation, search, video, social, and digital advertising. comScore's data and technologies are well established, crucial components in measuring and analyzing the evolving digital world. Widely used by publishers, advertising agencies, and advertisers alike. So over the next 15 to 20 minutes, we're going to walk through some of the key mobile trends, as we see it, that have shaped the last 12 months. From the platforms that consumers are using, the impact of multi-device usage, and ultimately, what people are actually doing on their smartphones. So let's have a quick look at the European mobile landscape, and then we'll come on to some the US landscape. The EU average for smartphone penetration is now a staggering 57%. Interestingly, it's led by Spain and the UK, so 66% and 64% have a smartphone in those countries. Germany and Italy are relative laggards in this respect at 51% and 53% respectively. However, overall, by breaching the 50% mark in Germany, December was the first time that all 5 EU5 countries had over 50% market share in a given month of the smartphone market. Although we don't have this specific slide on this in this presentation, in terms of the technology behind this huge growth, Samsung is the leading handset manufacturer in the EU5 with 32% market share. On the operating system side, Google now have over 50% market share relative to Apple's 20% and Symbian's 15%. So there's been a big change in the top of the table when it comes to operating system. This type of insight can help publishers and advertisers whilst deciding which development environments to prioritize for investment when launching new applications and services. The smartphone audience is a subset of the total mobile audience, and we're currently seeing 136 million smartphone users across the EU5. That's out of a total of 240 million mobile phone users aged 13 or above in the EU5. Germany is the most populous nation, contributing the highest volume of 61 million. I think another notable situation in the multi-device measurement is that we're seeing the massive growth of tablets into the mix. So this additional platform we're actually seeing over 23 million smartphone users in the EU5 alone have a tablet, and that's grown a whopping 94% in the last year. But what does that mean in terms of overall internet traffic? So whilst the platforms might be different, the consumers using them are often the same. So it's time to look at multi-platform usage in more detail. Across Europe, in January 2013, 20% of all pages that were consumed were from non-PC devices. So that's 1 in 5, 20% of all internet traffic is coming via a mobile or a tablet. You can see the breakdown there. Mobile accounts for 15% and tablet is just over 4%. The other devices here are other connected devices such as consoles and connected TVs. How does that affect, how is that broken down across Europe? So you'll see that the UK is very much leading the way. So 32% roughly of all the traffic in the UK is from a non-PC device, and that compares to just 4% or just under 4% in Turkey. It's important to note when media companies are making investment decisions around which platforms to develop content services for. Now, I think this is quite an interesting slide. We've presented this in various formats within comScore over the last 6 months, and it always gets a lot of interest and traction. It's worth considering when these different devices are actually used to better understand consumer behaviour. So we plotted usage across a random day, in this case Sunday the 17th of February, and looked at the distribution of total usage for each device across day part. What we find here is that mobiles and tablets lead against PCs in the early morning segment, but PCs take over in the daytime and the first part of early evening. Then mobile and tablets, again, see the highest proportionate level of usage in the prime evening slot. What are people actually doing on their smartphones? So what activities are they consuming on mobile? In terms of the popular content, you can see that email leads the way, with almost 81 million users across Europe, this is the EU5, sorry, using personal email on the phone, and over 40 million accessing for work emails. Weather, social networking, and instant messaging occupy the next spots. Over 56 million users access news content, and then we've seen maps also being used by over 51 million users. Interesting in the context that mapping site usage on PC across the EU5 has seen a 4% decline in users in the past 12 months. So these people are now actually using mapping services on the mobile as opposed to PC. What do Europeans, what are they actually using the mobile for? We're looking at the extent to which Europeans are using their smartphones to access mobile media. We've seen a significant shift in the last 12 months. Approaching 60% of smartphone users now use mobile media, which is a 30% growth from the 46.4% back in December 2011. Indeed, at the other end of the spectrum, the proportion using just voice services, so not SMS or mobile media, has fallen from 11.5% to just over 8%. More usage of mobile media makes mobile an even more appealing channel for connecting with consumers, given its scale. On to NFC. This is clearly quite a big growth area. It's still the lack of Apple devices on NFC is holding it back slightly, but on the whole, with the growth of Android devices having NFC, it's a huge growth area. So you've seen a rise of 442% year on year in NFC-enabled devices. That's since March 2012. Over 4 million smartphones now have NFC chips, and Samsung again leads the way with 50% of the market, followed by BlackBerry with 18%. So on to the US mobile landscape. We thought it was also worth touching on this marketplace, and in terms of smartphone penetration, it was up a whopping 29% year on year to nearly 126 million smartphone users. Interestingly, 72% of all newly acquired devices were smartphones, and in real terms this is up just under 13% year on year. Again, tablets are playing a prominent role. It took smartphones nearly a decade from their first introduction to reach 40 million owners. Tablets have crossed that threshold in only 2 years since the launch of the iPad. And understanding this tablet phenomenon is critical for any company in the business of digital media, publishing, advertising, or consumer electronics. The first smartphone in the US was actually a KIO-C-RAD device running Palm operating system, introduced in early 2001. And the first iPad was released in April 2010. I think it's quite incredible to think that that was only 3 years ago. Mobile devices now account for 13% of all internet traffic in the US. This is showing a growth of 173% for tablet and 67% for smartphones. Again, this is in the US market. As you can see, the mobile content consumption is impacting PC consumption. These devices are being used by your customers to engage with your brand. For the first time, you'll see the stat on the left of the chart here. PC traffic has actually gone down year on year because people are spending more time on the internet via their mobile or tablet. People are spending more and more time on the mobile device rather than a PC. According to our MMX multi-platform tool, 1 in 3 minutes is now spent in the US on mobile devices. What are people doing in the US? You can see the key activities where mobile is most popular and more popular than PC: accessing maps, weather, music, social networking. So slightly different to the EU, but the key categories are largely the same. Again, the source for this is our MMX multi-platform tool. Connections via Wi-Fi. This is quite critical as well. They're improving increasingly popular. So 42% of all smartphone connections are done via Wi-Fi, while 94% of all tablet connections are via Wi-Fi. And this is from our US Device Essentials product. Happy to go through methodologies if you want to take that offline as well. The tablets are also disrupting the home. So as well as being largely Wi-Fi only, it's highest in the home with 91% usage. When connecting to the internet, so via 3G, it's more likely to be done in a public location. 36% of usage is a public location, whilst 26% at work. Now, apologies for this US term, but we are a US company. But one of the key things that we're tracking now is this idea that smartphones is encouraging showrooming. So the idea of people are researching product features, comparing prices, finding store locations or coupons, and even just checking product availability via the device in store without necessarily buying something on their phone at the time, but they may well come home and buy via a PC or a laptop or another connected device. So you can see that in terms of comparing prices and finding store locations, they're actually going to make a purchase via the device. 38% of all tablet owners and 19% of smartphone owners will do this. This concept of showrooming has really caught on. So in summary then, from our piece of the presentation, clearly today's consumer is a multi-platform digital omnivore. They're not just using one device to connect to the internet. Taken together, mobile devices are becoming the digital centre of gravity for consumers, connecting them to the digital and physical world. And I think it's clear that experiences need to be persistent and consistent across devices and appropriate to device and usage context. And with that, I'm delighted to pass you over to Anthony Payne, who's going to look at how you can future-proof your mobile strategy.
Okay, great. So thank you very much, Gregor, for this part of the presentation. I will now change presenter rights and hand it over to Anthony. Just a second. Okay, so Anthony, you should be in charge now.
Great, thank you very much, Lars, and thanks, Gregor, for the information, the details provided. So as Lars said at the beginning, I'll spend the next 15, 20 minutes or so talking essentially about how organizations can respond to the information that Gregor has just shared with us and how they develop a strategy that essentially future-proofs them against what is arguably the most fluid, evolving and rapidly changing technology sector that we've ever seen. I think the data point that Gregor used that best illustrates that for me is the incredible growth rate of tablets, which when launched were kind of perceived to be a nice-to-have luxury addition as opposed to the essential phone device they're using. But the growth suggests that that's not necessarily how the market sees it. By way of, I'm just trying to change the slide. There we go. So sort of by way of sort of starting us off then, I think as companies think about how they're going to future-proof themselves against or in order to take best advantage of the huge mobile opportunity that's out there, the first thing to try and do is try and predict what's going to happen. But as indicated already, in this market, that's perhaps arguably harder than in any technology sector than we have ever seen. The pace of change is incredible. There's a huge range of players that contribute to this sector, from the device manufacturers, the operating system manufacturers, app developers, and of course the carriers. Every one of those players has to innovate to differentiate from their competition in their chosen field. And as a consequence, when that all comes together to deliver a mobile website to a customer on a device at the end of the virtual line, you have a huge number of factors which will cause change and add to the complexity of developing your mobile website. And this stat or this example is not unkindly picking on Gartner, but nobody should envy them and their peers in the analyst community having to predict what's going to happen. As you can see here, how badly wrong you can get it. Although interestingly, the data points that Gregor shared, they actually got the total market share of Android and Symbian fairly close. What they failed to recognize was Symbian's huge decline and Apple's growth, of course. So we can all sympathize with how difficult it is to predict actually what's going to happen in this market. And companies developing their mobile web presence face this same challenge. Sorry, I'm just waiting for a slide to change. There we go. It's also a market in which major events can take the industry by total surprise, and those major events can in turn, of course, cause knock-on events. So who would have predicted back in May 2012 when Google acquired Motorola, who would have predicted that acquisition? And the potential impact to that when we're thinking about developing our web presence for mobile devices could be very, very significant. Android now, as everyone knows, enjoys a very strong position in terms of market share for smartphone and increasingly for tablet devices around the world. But having acquired Motorola, it does raise in the minds of those device manufacturers building, using, or selling devices using the Android operating system, to what extent they're going to be able to enjoy a level playing field, or to what extent Google is going to favor their own device set. And so that causes these device manufacturers to consider alternatives, and we all know Samsung have a number of alternatives that they already go to market with, and we're also aware of other operating systems that are being launched, for example, Windows Phone and BlackBerry 10 earlier this year and last year, and of course the recently announced Firefox and Ubuntu operating systems. So when something like this, some major event like this happens in the industry, it causes ripples and disruptions across the board, which makes it much more difficult for companies to predict what's going to happen and to recognize, for example, that it's just going to be Android and iOS operating systems that they need to develop their mobile web presence for. So with that background then, the key question is, how do you accommodate that? How do you develop a strategy that can accommodate this change and can accommodate the fact that at any given moment we could see this kind of major event disrupting the industry and changing what we thought was a set path? And in our view, the only practical approach here is to actively plan and organize for constant change. You need to develop an approach which flexes and to accommodate that variety, and it's a variety that realistically is only set to increase. So we like to look at 3 areas where we think companies can consider how they develop a strategy and how they build flexibility into that strategy. And those are the 3 you see on the screen: organization, technology, and data. And we're going to have a look at each of those 3 right now. So first of all, thinking about organization, I think arguably you could draw exactly the same chart as this for any number of technologies, and particularly customer-facing technologies that have come to the fore over the last 20 years, whether it's marketing automation tools, whether it's web content management, of course the original cycle of the web on the desktop, and now again for mobile. Quite often what happens is the marketing department, recognizing this is a new way to communicate with customers and ever seeking to get closer to those customers and gain differentiation and competitive advantage by getting closer to the customers, that marketing department recognized the need to deliver an experience which is different. And in the case of mobile, what often happened is companies developed silo projects, whether it was a mobile application for a particular operating system or potentially multiple operating systems, or they went out and took developed a version of their desktop or PC-based website and developed that on mobile. But what tended to happen is these are siloed activities by arguably forward-thinking parts of the marketing team, perhaps from around the world. And as has happened in the desktop world, well, what's typically happened is the ownership for the desktop web has kind of been operationalized. Yes, it's typically the case that marketing owns these kind of the objective setting, the design, the creative, and that aspect of it. But more often than not, the IT department is responsible for the kind of operational management, maintenance, and infrastructure of web projects. And as a consequence, you get the kind of enterprise-grade benefits. You get service level agreements and guarantees and uptime and all that kind of stuff, whereas marketing gets to deliver the experiences it wants to. Mobile, in very few companies, has actually reached this stage, and what we find is forward-leaning companies are the ones that are rapidly sort of moving from bottom left to top right on this chart. And as they do so, as they become more mature from a mobile organizational perspective, they see that their mobile conversion rates increase. And this is because by moving to a more coordinated approach, you can ensure that your brand is represented in the same way across all of the mobile touch points, whether apps or mobile websites. And importantly, that the experience is represented in a consistent way. So you might have one part of your organization or one brand that has a tablet optimized site. But that same brand for a different part of the campaign may not have a tablet optimized site. And customers are starting to vote with their feet when they see that. If they go to a site which doesn't behave like they expect it to do, doesn't offer the functionality, or worse, the functionality that's there is broken, they react by leaving. If you're lucky, they'll go and look at your desktop site. If you're unlucky, they'll give up altogether and perhaps go to a competitor's site. So by operationalizing it and moving into a more mature state from an organizational perspective, companies can ensure that they're delivering a coordinated and consistent experience to their customers across all of their brands and all of their mobile web presence. For more information on this topic, just as an aside, you may be interested in a report, a recent white paper developed by industry analysts IDC on one approach which they think can help companies manage the organizational aspects of their mobile strategy. And this is something they're terming mobile centers of excellence. So I won't spend any further time on that now, but I do encourage you to go to the URL you see there and download the paper. As an indication of its importance, what IDC is finding is that while 80% of companies are investing in mobile development projects, which perhaps shouldn't surprise us at all, fewer than 5% spend any money at all on establishing a corresponding organizational approach to that. And effectively what that means is you still see very disparate, disjointed and siloed approaches to mobile in a way that you wouldn't countenance for any other marketing activity. The idea of a marketing leader not looking at an integrated campaign with all of the various channels to market would be unheard of, yet in mobile it's absolutely still happening. And IDC proposed a way to handle that, as well as, of course, to incorporate initiatives in the B2E arena as well. So we've talked about organization. The second of our topics then, or focus areas, in order to accommodate this huge change and build a strategy that's future-proof, is technology. And in many ways, you could argue that the mobile sector is similar to, again, to what happened for something like the web content management environment a few years ago. Back then, companies embarking on desktop projects would build or half-build their own bespoke CMS systems due to a lack of options out there in the market. Very few organizations, I'd argue practically none, would choose to build from the ground up a bespoke content management system today. There'd be no need to. There's too many options out there across all sorts of price ranges. And frankly, the complexity and expertise needed to build that structure is beyond most companies, and it simply can't justify that investment. And in mobile, we're moving to a similar situation. There are capabilities, or rather there are complexities, which demand a platform approach which shields companies from having to deal with that complexity, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. Just touching on the complexity, the browser wars in the desktop world kind of gave us a clue as to what was coming. You'll remember back in the 90s and early noughties, where developing for a desktop site meant you had to understand how IE handled pages, how Netscape handled pages, and then more recently Safari, Opera, Chrome, etc. Those complexities pale compared to the environment we're living in with mobile. Just thinking about form factors and screen sizes, through to a 2-inch screen on a feature phone, right through to a 60-inch plus plasma screen on a smart TV, web access in your car, and all of the screen sizes in between. And also, importantly, all of the contexts that customers are in when they're connecting to your websites. There's no way companies can keep pace with all of the change and variety that's implicit in that. How do you handle all those screen sizes? How do you handle all those contexts just by building code in the traditional way? And then there's that other example which is alluded to on this slide, which sounds, and frankly is, rather like a rather specific technical point, but it's an example of the kind of change that can happen and can impact you. So a short while ago, Google announced that it was going to diverge from its existing approach to the rendering engine inside the Chrome browser. So right now, the Chrome browser, or rather up until recently, the Chrome browser used the same rendering engine as you find in Safari, Apple's browser, and a number of other browsers on the market. That meant, as a developer, you had a certain amount of standardization or a consistent way of dealing with presentation of content on the web. Google's announcement that they're going to diverge from this for the Chrome browser means that for an increasing number of customers or increasing number of customers connecting to your website, they'll no longer be using a WebKit-based browser, and that means for developers they're going to have to do more testing, and they're going to have to accommodate all those small, seemingly minor changes that come from that, but which actually can deliver a poor experience for customers. So again, seemingly very specific technical change, but it's an example of something that companies will have to accommodate and developers will have to deal with as they're building experiences for customers. Now, this isn't in any way a technical presentation, but very briefly I wanted to just touch on how companies approach building mobile web experiences today, and then look at ways in which they can evolve and augment that. Essentially, when you're building a mobile site, as I'm sure many of you on the call know, no developer starts from scratch. There will be no point. You'll always start with some either development framework or some combination of code libraries which effectively give you shortcuts and pre-built code for most of the assets and components from which you're assembling your website. You then need to debug that, put in the populate with the content that you want, and gradually assemble your website in that way. And at the end of it all, of course, test it. Now, the most common technique for developing sites for mobile users today is responsive web design. Now, again, this isn't a technical presentation. You can all, those of you that are not familiar, I'm sure, can all go and do plenty of reading about a subject that's very widely written about. But essentially, what responsive web design does, it provides developers with a very elegant methodology for adjusting content and layout to accommodate different screen sizes. Now, the basic principle here is they develop a series of layouts to reflect the different size or different categories, size categories of screens on devices connecting to their website. They develop these websites using these layouts using CSS, so that when a device connects to a web page, you can send the same content to any device, and then using media queries and JavaScript, effectively that page figures out which device it's on and how best to render that information on the device. And what you avoid is that horrible experience on going to a desktop site on a small phone, and it's frankly unusable. There's way too much pinching and zooming, buttons are too small, text is too small, and it's unusable. So responsive web design is a really elegant way, a really elegant starting point for addressing this. But our focus, or our view, is that there's a huge opportunity, which companies are increasingly taking, to develop experiences which go beyond just adjusting for screen size. And there are a set of services which can be used alongside responsive web design techniques to make it easier to develop those sites, but more importantly, to ensure that those sites work on every device, not just a subset. Every feature works, whether it's a video playing on the screen, whether it's an image, a slider, some other touch functionality, even down to a little drop-down box allowing companies to select their credit card expiry date on an e-commerce site. Each of these is powered by JavaScript and HTML behind the scenes, and if that doesn't work, customers will get a poor experience and they will leave. And if it's an e-commerce site, that means a lost sale. If it's a brand-oriented site, that leads a slightly less happy fan or potential customer, and they've gone somewhere else. So ensuring that it works for every customer is hugely important. And so by using a set of services, and at the heart of that is device detection, and we'll talk about it in a moment, developers are able to learn more about the customer that's connecting, and in particular their device, and make decisions in order to serve up the right content, the right structure, the right functionality right from the start, without having to use valuable bandwidth to send particularly large files down to the device first off, and potentially risk alienating that customer. So accurately identifying different device classifications. Although it's possible to identify a device using media queries on the device, it's rather difficult to do, and using a device database and device library helps you do that in a much more accurate way, in a way that is possible to remain future-proof because you can rely on the vendor of that device database to stay current. Recognizing the different input methods, so whether it's a keyboard-enabled device, a click wheel, a touch screen, or a cursor, identifying those and serving up functionality appropriate. Don't serve up touch screen functionality to a device that can't use it, because all you're doing is sending additional load down to the device and it won't be used. So you're slowing down the connection speed, or worse, you're presenting functionality that's optimized for touch to a customer that can't use it, and they're going to have a poor experience and they're going to leave. Also, importantly, and speed and performance come out right at the top of all of the surveys that we do amongst our customers and organizations beyond. Ensuring your website loads as quickly as possible is hugely important, and being able to identify how fast the connection is, what level of bandwidth the customer has, and then use other performance sort of metrics such as how well that particular device handles JavaScript, what battery life is available on the device, how strong the processor is. Not everybody has a Galaxy Samsung S4. There is a very wide range of devices out there. Identifying all of those performance features enables you to serve up the right size and the right functionality to every device first time, and ensure that every customer gets a quick page load, not just those in the very top-end devices over a super fast Wi-Fi connection. We'll talk about this later, but you can also take into account location and the context of your customer by making certain assumptions about the device that's connecting and their context, and you can serve up more targeted content. One particular example that many companies face that kind of is an extension of that is around image size. And very simply, as you all know, websites are increasingly image heavy. People love to see pictures on their sites, whether it's product pictures or lifestyle photos and everything in between. The kind of image that looks great on a 9.7-inch iPad screen connecting over a Wi-Fi connection will simply drown a feature phone, or even a low or mid-tier smartphone. So the normal approach with responsive web design is to send the full image to every device and then scale down based on the device that it's sent to. The trouble is you've sent the file already, which means the device, the bandwidth, the connection to that device needs to actually transport that data, which slows down the web experience for the customer, and then it takes time for the device to actually shrink that down to the appropriate size. The best approach, we think, is to use a service widely available to developers to effectively store a single copy of the image, and then on the fly convert that to the right-sized image, crop it if necessary. So it's not just a question of shrinking to the same photo down to a smaller size. You can also crop so that the center of attention of that particular picture is still visible and easy to see. But send the right-sized image to every device first time, and therefore delivering the fastest possible experience to every customer. So that's just an example of how, in the real world, optimizing based on information you can already know about the device before you serve the very first piece of content enables you to give a better experience to your customers. And before I move on to the point about data, I did just want to draw attention to a piece of data that we pulled from our own system. So we serve billions and billions of web impressions every month to customers of ours, and so we're able to capture a great deal of information about the type of devices connecting to customers around the world. And one of the key metrics that we pull from that data is this one. And what this shows is that if you were to focus your testing and your build and testing cycles on even the top 10 devices in the particular country or region you're operating in, and I suspect most of you would acknowledge, most companies would acknowledge that few companies actually test on 10 different devices anyway. It's more likely to be 3, 4, or 5. But even if you did the top 10, you would still not be testing for the numbers you see on that screen. So in the least worst case, 42% of traffic in North America, 42% of traffic in Western Europe. But as you go further east and further south, you'll see you're excluding from your test cycles a very, very significant portion of customers or potential customers that could be connecting to your website. It isn't, of course, the case that for none of those customers, for any of those customers, it will automatically just not work. But you don't know. And I would venture that in most technology delivery scenarios, or in most sort of physical presence scenarios, a retail environment, you wouldn't readily exclude or risk excluding 58% of your customers because you didn't test and you didn't accommodate their particular needs. And yet that's what companies are doing by failing to test for anything beyond, as I say, the top 10. So this shows, or this serves to show, I think, that the variety that's out there and is set to continue. So the final section I want to talk about is data. So we talked a little bit about the importance of the organizational structure to deliver a mobile experience. We've talked about the technology that's available for developers, so service-based technology to help augment responsive web design approaches to building mobile sites. The other aspect of using those services or additional those services to augment responsive web design is it gives you access to a huge amount of additional information or data that you can use to serve what is arguably the most basic marketing principle out there, and that is identify your customer, identify the characteristics that make them unique or enable you to segment those customers, and then target them with a particular message, a particular experience, a particular offer that you think is most likely to resonate and result in the kind of behavior you want, whether that's a purchase, a repeat visit, getting them to come to your store, or in the mobile web world, getting them to like a particular video you posted, getting them to forward a piece of content, getting them to join the loyalty program. So that marketing basic of identifying your customers, segmenting them, and then targeting them with offers, there's a huge amount of data associated with their mobile use, which companies can use in order to do that in a more efficient and more effective way. And the best way to explain it, I think, is through two examples. So the first example is this. If you're using server-side components to help with your mobile web experience, you can learn location. Now, this isn't, of course, the only way to learn location. There are other ways to determine location, but it is part of being able to detect using server-side detection. But you can also detect other features, including bandwidth, but also what type of device they're using. So, for example, is it a top-end, say, $500 plus device, or is it an entry-level device more like $50? What type of technology that device is able to handle? So does it have a touch screen? Does it support GPS, and therefore you could provide navigation capabilities? And as we said earlier, is the device connecting via a slow or fast connection? So each of these points that I've just referred to represents a piece of information that you can determine about every customer connecting to your site. You can then segment those customers, and you can profile to the point where you say, okay, if a customer is connecting to my site and they're in a given location, They're connecting over a very fast connection, so they've got great bandwidth. They're using a top-end device which is able to handle JavaScript very well. They've got their GPS locator switch on, and you present them with the option as to whether or not you want them to, they're prepared to allow you to use their location. You can then take advantage of that information to provide to that customer the richest information about your product, your offer, your store location, whatever it is you want to communicate to them. You can provide it using a touch-based interface because you can know they can use it. You can take advantage of the fact they've got GPS on. You know they're out and about. You know they're within, let's say, half a mile of your store. And so you can provide mapping right away. So you can segment that group of users. You know information about them, and you can target the information you want to present to them. Similarly, however, the same customer or the chap standing next to that same customer might be using a much cheaper device, might be very low on battery life, might be on a different network and have something like a 2G connection at that moment. They're not using a touchscreen device and it's got a small screen. They're also visiting your website. And while you'd love to serve that same information to them, if you do, that connection will mean that it's so slow, that functionality will be so poor, half the functionality won't work, it will take too long, that customer will leave, they won't bother, they'll walk right past your store. So in order to attract that customer to come in, you need to serve up content which is appropriate to that device. So more text-based, smaller images. Don't bother offering them a mapping feature because they haven't got a GPS locator, or if they have, it's not switched on that particular device, which you can determine. Send them quick information which can present that same information, new stock in for a particularly popular product, and encourage them in that way. So you can segment your users, give the best one where you're able to give the best experience to customers, but where you're not able to, still give a great experience and maximize your reach. Too often, the way companies approach it is they're excited by the flashy, exciting stuff, and as a consequence, they alienate and give a poor experience to too significant a part of their user base. And that results in poorer conversion rate than they might otherwise achieve. Another example of how you can use data is to kind of address this sort of slightly gnarly issue of what you might call the in-between devices. These are the devices that have grown up in this category between what you might call a large smartphone and a tablet, the so-called phablet category between 5 and 7 inches. It's not just screen size that varies, though. Some of these devices have SIM cards. So some of them are rather more mobile devices. They're used as telephones and can be treated as, frankly, large phones. Others don't. Others are Wi-Fi only. They have no SIM card. But they still only have a 6 or 7 inch screen, which means to serve up the same kind of content that you would to a 9.7 inch screen iPad, full-size iPad, might actually result in an aggravating experience. Those of you that have used, that have browsed the web on a 7 inch tablet will know that too often sites aren't optimized at all well for devices of that size. They expect you to pinch and zoom too much, and it's kind of like using a smartphone again, where buttons are too small, text is too small, and you're not able to enjoy that site as well as you might. Now, the dynamic that I haven't talked about too much or at all so far is that your customers visiting your websites have been conditioned to expect a native app-like experience when they're visiting your website. That's what Apple and latterly Android and the other device manufacturers have driven in terms of their expectations. They expect big buttons, great UIs, really fast functionality, and when they're surfing to your website, they're increasingly expecting that kind of experience. So if you want to deliver that experience, you have to know what type of device they're on, what type of functionality they're on. And as this phablet category grows, you have to determine, am I going to treat this as a smartphone? Am I going to treat it very much like a more mobile device? Am I going to treat it like a more static device, like an iPad, that's used in the evening, as we saw from Gregor's data? Or am I actually going to develop a view and some functionality specific to this in-between category in order to maximize conversion from them? And again, there is data available from services that helps you very, very accurately identify which device is connecting, whether it's connecting over a cell connection, whether it has a good connection speed, whether it's touch-enabled, how well it's able to support JavaScript, whether GPS is switched on, etc., and you can make decisions based on that information. Okay, we've come to the end of the slot, and I've run over, as is perhaps inevitable, so my apologies. But very quickly, in summary, our recommendation, based on the huge change and flux in this industry, and a change that we expect to continue indefinitely, is to make sure your organization develops an organizational structure, a technology stack, and makes use of data in a way that's able to cope with that change and takes best advantage so that you can achieve differentiation and competitive advantage. There are tools and services available to web developers that augment responsive web design, so they can gain further information, address some of the challenges with responsive web design, and deliver better experiences that they know work across all devices. And you can also take advantage of the contextual information delivered by such services in order to make better decisions, to better target your users, and therefore increase conversion rates as a result. Okay, with that, I'll hand back to Lars for the last couple of minutes, if we have it, for some questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Anthony. Thank you very much, Gregor. Actually, so you already said it. We overran slightly, so I think we don't have any time left for answering questions, unfortunately. So apologies for our suboptimal time management here, but we will we'll definitely follow up directly after this session with everyone who sent in a question to answer these questions directly.